Hello and welcome everyone back to the Altengrad city in City Skylines. Today we will look at all the projects built in the city since the end of the Second World War to the end of the 1960s. Let's summarize the important changes and mention how some projects will continue into the future. And since after this episode we will start building in the 70s, let's also introduce that new decade to put things into some context. So first, for the finished project. In the video, there will be little notes for each of these shots with the name of the project and episode number, so you can revisit that if you want to. In the late 1940s, we mostly focused on repairing the damage, temporarily fixing some infrastructure, and also building new housing, but we quickly moved into the 1950s. There we started talking about probably the biggest topic of the whole post-war period, and that is of course housing. What were the challenges that cities and city planners faced, and what were some of the solutions? This of course started the overall topic of prefabricated concrete panel technology and the huge residential estates that would drastically change the looks of many Central European cities. The importance of this topic is exactly in the scale of such projects. I've seen people mention how it's some obscure topic, some historical footnote, an architectural, urbanistic dead end or something, but all of that doesn't really matter. The reality is that the panel buildings are around every corner around here, on the outskirts of all big and small cities, and they will stay with us for decades to come, not to mention that they still house millions of people around the whole region. So it's my belief that it is worth understanding the context surrounding the design philosophies, theory, and on the other hand reality, and even the technical backgrounds, since the buildings require constant care. In the mini sub-series dedicated to this topic, we first built a small experimental housing area where the architects and engineers tested the panel prefabrication. We then moved for more high-quantity projects by first establishing a new cement factory, and then in the 1960s a panel factory, followed by the theoretical background of the modernist urban design and practical process of building a panel house. And actually in the very next episode, I would like to continue this topic by doing a very large episode about the evolution of post-war urban planning, with high focus on real-world examples. But post-war housing was not done with just modernist or functionalist approaches, but there was also the short time period of socialist realism, from the late 1940s to the second half of the 50s. So we talked about what it is and built a few examples in the city, including the hotel right in the city center and then the large residential district on the outskirts, which was not finished with that style but with the prefabricated blocks of flats later. In the 1950s, we also built a new large bus station close to the city center and lightly touched the topic of switching fuel sources, moving away from coal. A couple of war memorials popped up in the city. And last but not least, we introduced the very important topic of industry and how the Eastern Bloc countries massively expanded heavy industry, which is a topic that is unsurprisingly tied to pretty much everything else: transportation, housing, economy, or the environment. In the 1960s, we started with introducing the emerging architectural trends and how they shaped cities since then. The 1960s was also a decade that saw massive car booms in Central European countries, depending on the region, of course. So we started fixing traffic by adding more lanes and talking about the historical context of people getting cars and how many cars there actually were. Trains in the Eastern Bloc were dealt with next by building a new train station, upgrading the central main station, and electrifying some additional tracks. The 60s also saw a continuation of heavy industry expansion, so that was the harbor expansion project, during which we covered the topic of hydroelectricity and waterways in Central Europe. And we wrapped up the decade by building a new technical university campus, hospital, and a few smaller projects all around the city. So that was the 60s decade in Altengrad in terms of actual projects. Let's now talk about some historical context for the end of 1960s and the whole 1970s, so we know what's in front of us, but also how the real-world regions fared in those times. There are some common aspects, but we cannot generalize anymore across the countries, since the developments, political, societal, or economical, were somewhat different. But let's just try to briefly introduce the overall situations without going into too much detail. In Czechoslovakia, the major event was the 1968 invasion of Warsaw Pact armies. This event was a reaction to certain loosening of some tight ideological policies regarding censorship, cultural life, and economy, which did not sit well with the Soviet leadership. It is exactly the year 1968, its first half before the invasion at least, from which we have all kinds of media sources, television clips, newspaper articles, where we see interviews with architects, engineers, city planners, or even some officials speaking freely about various things, painting an overall picture of those times. We don't see anything like that post-1968, only various little bits carefully pointing out the visible things, like lack of quality of certain buildings, worsening environment due to traffic, and so on, but very rarely discussing the background issues and never mentioning the system as a whole. This is due to the political development post-1968, during which many tight policies were put back in place in the period usually referred to as normalization. Although economically, the very late 1960s and first half of 70s were a period of relative prosperity, partially thanks to some pre-1968 reforms. Infrastructure was massively built, although with the usual 70s style, so cutting down city blocks for urban highways. Housing projects were completed from the 60s projects, and new gigantic ones started as well. But again, with a catch. Many capable architects or urban planners did not have the correct political beliefs, so emigrated or were fired from their jobs post-68. The political system also heavily pushed extreme rationalization and quantity-first approach. Car ownership increased. The regime overall promoted, to a certain degree, consumerism and tried to increase wealth of the population as much as possible. So that was the specific development for Czechoslovakia, a brief one, of course, but there are similarities with the other countries, for example, in higher focus on housing projects, further expansion of infrastructure and industry, and some level of consumerism promotion. The following economic introduction can apply to the whole region, though. The protests and repressions seen in the 1950s and 60s in various countries clearly taught the communist leaderships that the only way to stabilize the societies and prevent further unrest would be to increase the standards of living, and, at least on the surface, not show force too much. So people would let authoritarian practices, corruption, and other bad decisions slide. It worked, at least for a while. But the increase in standards of living were bought by worsening economic situations as past reserves dried and foreign debt piled up, because the local economies were simply not up to the task of raising the standards sustainably. The oil crises also finally caught up with the socialist countries. The oil shocks did not affect them too much initially, but the Soviet oil prices gradually increased because Central Europe was buying the Soviet oil for a certain average price, not current market price. But at some point during the late 1970s, this average price reached the Western market rate and even exceeded it, as the Western prices dropped, but the Eastern Bloc countries still bought it for the previous averages from the previous time periods. Overall, the economies of the whole region were on a noticeable decline towards the end of the 1970s. There were significant differences between the countries in various economic specifics, though. So, just to mention a few, we already talked about the ban of private businesses of any size in Czechoslovakia, with some rare exceptions, while it was allowed in other countries. East Germany started a new wave of nationalizing small businesses in the 1970s, while these things were mostly done in other countries. Hungary in the 70s loosened the tight central control on companies, even allowing some freedoms in determining prices, while Czechoslovakia returned to it post-1968, and many other differences. Similarly, we can no longer generalize in terms of culture, level of censorship, personal freedoms, or just standards of living. To just mention one example, Hungary got the title of, quote, the happiest barracks, end quote, of the Eastern Bloc with relative stability, while, on the other hand, at the same time, Poland saw continued strikes and protests. Anyways, we are going to return to the various topics as we built Altengrad in the 1970s. Although, as I already started doing in some previous parts, I am going to talk about certain topics more broadly, as it would be just too fractured to only talk about, for example, housing of the 70s without providing some context of the other decades. I'm not really going into too much depth with these introductions anyway, so it only makes sense to make them more compact. So, as I already mentioned, in the next episode we will cover the evolution of urban planning for the whole second half of the 20th century in Central Europe, mostly focusing on the housing estates, of course, while looking at real-life places and examining those, so it's not just some abstract theory. Other projects will deal with some city center changes while talking about architecture, among other things. We will then build some new roads, add lanes here and there, and we will also finally cover public transport, most probably with some building project related to trams. Maybe a first-person tram ride could finally happen then as well. Other projects will be done too. If you have some project suggestions, places from real life built in the 70s or roughly in the 70s in Central Europe, feel free to write it in the comments. That will be all for this cinematic overview of the new places that were built after the war. Hope you liked it. Hope you will like even the things to come in the future. Thank you for watching today. Please help the video, help the channel by clicking thumbs up below, sharing the video or series if you think someone else might like it. Leave a comment, subscribe if you're new here, and if you like this a lot, you can directly support what I do here by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to all the existing channel members. Thank you so much for your support. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.